All right, class. Today will be our last lecture of the term as we get into and complete chapter 15. So as we get into chapter 15, we're really looking at the different parts of the nervous system. Specifically, we are starting to look at the autonomic nervous system. Now, we do touch on some of the somatic nervous system a little bit as basically a review. So when we look at the somatic nervous system is this consciously perceived or controlled process. So we're looking at what we detect from conscious awareness. So the somatic sensory portion detects signals from our special senses, which are going to include our vision, hearing, equilibrium, smell, and taste, and then also from the skin and our proprioceptors. Now, if we remember our somatic motor portion, that's what really involves the skeletal muscle system. So we're looking at the portion that sends the signals from the CNS to the skeletal muscle. So these are voluntary movements that involve the cerebrum, and then also including the reflexive movements that involve the brainstem and the spinal cord. So if we look at our somatic nervous system, you'll notice that this spinal cord graphic kind of resembles what we looked at just this last chapter. We have the spinal cord, we have our dorsal horn and our dorsal root to the back, we have our ventral horn and the ventral root coming forward. As those two join, we get the mixed nerve or the spinal nerve. You'll also notice here we have the dorsal root or the posterior root ganglion, where we have the accumulation of all of those sensory neurons. And you can follow the pathways all the way out. The somatic motor neuron goes out to the skeletal muscle. The somatic sensory neuron goes out to the skin, joints, and brings in all that information back towards our CNS. Now, when we look at the additional component of the functional organization, we also look at the autonomic nervous system, and that's going to be the major point of this particular chapter. So the autonomic nervous system functions to maintain homeostasis throughout the body. It often is operating in your subconscious control. So you really don't have to think about doing it, it just does it. It's going to innervate our smooth and cardiac muscle as well as our glands, and it makes adjustments to ensure that there's optimal support for our body activities. Again, we did say that it operates via subconscious control, and it helps to keep the conditions inside the body within our optimal ranges. Remember, we talked about the feedback system early on in chapter 1, I believe. And so we're looking at feedback as it pertains to this autonomic nervous system. Now, our autonomic nervous system also includes the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions, and we'll talk more about those here coming up. So here's our autonomic nervous system. Now you're going to notice that the pathway itself is just a little bit different. You'll notice again, we have our dorsal horn and the dorsal root, and that's going to include all of our sensory neurons, both from a somatic perspective and a visceral perspective. Again, we have the accumulation of those unipolar cells in the dorsal root ganglion. Those come in. You'll notice here we have a lot of it's going to involve the lateral horn, specifically when it comes to the sympathetic component of this nervous system. So the sympathetic neurons are still then going to leave through the ventral root and still become a part of that mixed spinal nerve. But you'll notice as it comes out, it's going to actually go through a little different section as opposed to leaving all the way straight through. We have a little bit of a branch coming off. And you'll also notice that we have these ganglia that help to accumulate cell bodies. And we'll talk about those pathways here coming up. But again, this will be a little bit of a good graphic for us to take a look at and review once we get through some of this other stuff. So within our body, we have dual innervation of a lot of our organs. And this means that these particular organs are going to receive input from both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions. And what that means then is that we're going to have these two divisions giving antagonistic or different cooperative effects, meaning we're going to have the sympathetic system perform one function or cause one response, and the parasympathetic division is going to cause a different response within the same organ. So when we look at the antagonistic effects of these two systems, we see that they commonly oppose each other. So for example, when we look at the control of the heart rate, the parasympathetic division is going to slow the heart rate, whereas the sympathetic division is actually going to increase the heart rate. And we see this because the cardiac cells actually have both cholinergic and adrenergic receptors. And those receptors basically respond to different types of hormones, and they cause different effects. If we look at the control of the muscular activity in the GI tract, we'll see that the parasympathetic system increases GI tract motility, and the sympathetic activity decreases motility. And again, the GI smooth muscle cells have both types of receptors. Same thing with the pupil diameter in the iris of the eye. We have parasympathetic activity that's going to decrease pupil diameter, and sympathetic activity is going to dilate the pupil. In the parasympathetic system, the fibers innervate the circular iris muscles, and the sympathetic fibers innervate the radial iris muscles. And so again, these are all just some examples, not completely inclusive, but these are just some examples of the differences between what happens in the parasympathetic division versus the sympathetic division. So if we take a look at the lower motor neurons of the somatic system versus the autonomic nervous system, we'll notice that there's a little bit of a difference. When we look at the lower motor neurons of the somatic nervous system, we notice that there's typically only one neuron. We've talked about the upper motor neurons coming down from the primary motor cortex, and then they come down, they synapse within that ventral horn, and they synapse with that lower motor neuron that basically extends out into the skeletal muscle. This lower motor neuron in the somatic nervous system is a thick, heavily myelinated somatic motor fiber, and it makes up each pathway from the CNS to the muscle. However, the lower motor neurons within the autonomic nervous system pathway is a two-neuron chain. We have a preganglionic neuron that's found within the CNS, or at least the cell body is found within the CNS. And it has a thin, lightly myelinated preganglionic axon. Now, the ganglionic neuron is going to be found within an autonomic ganglion, and it's going to have an unmyelinated postganglionic axon that extends to the effector organ. Now, these terms here are going to be relatively easy to understand once you understand the prefix and the suffix part of the term. When you look at the autonomic nervous system, we're always going to be synapsing within a ganglion. So the preganglionic neuron is going to be the neuron that's before the ganglion, therefore the pre-component of it. We also have a preganglionic axon, which again is the part of that cell that comes before the ganglia. The ganglionic neuron is going to be found within the ganglia, and that's going to be the location of the cell body of that neuron. The postganglionic axon then is going to be the axon that comes after the ganglia. And so what we see is that the postganglionic axon is the axon that's a part of the ganglionic neuron. So again, we'll be able to see some graphics of these as we move through this chapter. But again, one of the easiest ways to understand some of this material is to really just understand some of the terminology. So let's take a look at some of the neurotransmitter effects of the autonomic nervous system. Because the neurotransmitter and the receptors that those neurotransmitters bind to really are what help to determine what type of effect these neurons are going to have on the target tissue. When we look at the somatic nervous system, all of our somatic motor neurons are going to release acetylcholine. And we talked about that within our muscular system chapters. The effects in this case are always going to be stimulatory, or what we can also term as excitatory. In the ANS, we have our preganglionic fibers are going to release acetylcholine. Our postganglionic fibers are going to release two different types of neurons. In the sympathetic system, or the majority of the sympathetic system, the postganglionic fibers release norepinephrine. In our parasympathetic system, our postganglionic axons are going to release acetylcholine. Now again, the determining factor of a lot of this is not only the neurotransmitter, but also the receptor. So in this case, the effects can either be stimulatory or inhibitory for those postganglionic fibers. And it depends on the type of receptor that's found across that cleft and on the target tissue. So if we look at these lower motor neurons of the autonomic nervous system, you'll see here that we have it coming out of the spinal cord in this case. We have the preganglionic neuron cell body. It's going to be located here. In this case, we're kind of looking at a sympathetic system fiber, at least for this particular example, if we say they're coming out of the lateral horn. So we have that preganglionic neuron cell body located here. We have our preganglionic axon that's still coming before the ganglia. We then get to the ganglia, which is an autonomic ganglia. These preganglionic fibers are going to release acetylcholine. Now we get to the postganglionic axon, and here we have our postganglionic neuron, and this is the neuron or the cell body of this ganglionic neuron. We have our postganglionic axon, and again, depending on whether this is the parasympathetic system or the sympathetic system, helps to determine what type of neurotransmitter is going to be released. Again, in most sympathetic fibers, we're going to be releasing norepinephrine. In most parasympathetic fibers, we're going to be releasing acetylcholine. So let's look at the overall role of the parasympathetic division. The parasympathetic division really promotes maintenance and activities and really helps to conserve body energy. And its activity is going to be illustrated in a person who is relaxing, reading, or right after a meal. You know, perfect example is right during Thanksgiving dinner. You have an increase in food coming in, and so you're going to start to see a lot of these responses to the body from the parasympathetic division. Your blood pressure is going to go down. Your heart rate is going to go down. Your respiratory rates are all going to go down. Mainly because, again, we're focusing more on body maintenance activities, and we're conserving much of our energy. Again, because we're just taking in food and we're now getting ready to relax, maybe watch football or whatever you do on Thanksgiving, we have an increase in that gastrointestinal tract activity. And if we look at our pupils, the pupils are constricted and the lenses are accommodated for close vision. Because at this point, we're not so concerned with everything that's going on around us. We are in more of a conservation mode and body activity mode. Now, if we look at the role of the sympathetic division, you're going to see that a lot of these responses are going to be the opposite of the parasympathetic division. This is the system that we typically refer to as the fight or flight system. It's going to mobilize the body during activity, and it promotes adjustments during exercise or when the body is threatened. So think about when you're in a tough situation. The example I always use in class when we do real lecture is talking about a bear coming into the classroom and running down the aisleway. You have this situation where your body is now under attack in a sense. You have the opportunity to fight or flight. You know, you can stand up and fight the bear, or you can run. But either way, your body is preparing to survive. So blood flow is now going to be shunted more towards the skeletal muscle and to the heart, because we have to have an increase in ATP, in food stores, in glucose. We have to have an increase in oxygen. So we have all this stuff that now has to be shunted more towards skeletal muscle and heart because of the activity that's going to be utilized. Because we need more oxygen, the bronchioles are now going to dilate, so we get more oxygen into the lungs, and the liver releases more glucose into the bloodstream that we now see as being shunted more towards the skeletal muscle. You're also going to see an increase in adrenaline, which is going to cause a whole series of changes there as well. So if we look at some of the anatomic differences in the lower motor neurons, and this is in a comparison of just the parasympathetic and the sympathetic system. This slide in particular, I'd probably highlight and star it because it's going to be a really good overview of the differences between the two systems. And it'll really help you identify a lot of the other characteristics that we talk about. When we look at the parasympathetic division, it's going to be cranial sacral. So we're talking about those 4 cranial nerves, cranial nerve 3, 7, 9, and 10, and also from the sacral division. So we're looking at those neurons that accumulate or come out of the S2 to S4 spinal cord regions. When we look at the preganglionic axons are going to be long, but postganglionic axons are going to be short, which means the ganglia are going to be closer to or within the effector organ to allow our bodies to have a shorter postganglionic axon. And then we'll notice that our preganglionic axons have very few branches. The sympathetic system, on the other hand, is really the reverse of what we just said about the parasympathetic division. We're going to be involving the thoracolumbar division, which again really involves the spinal cord levels of T2-ish to L2, or you'll notice here in the next slide right around T1 to L2. So really that thoracic spine area. And that's where our preganglionic neurons, specifically the cell bodies, are going to be located, and that's going to be within those lateral horns of those levels. The preganglionic axons are going to be short, and the postganglionic axons are going to be long. And so the ganglia are actually going to be close to the spinal cord. And that's where we get a structure called the sympathetic chain. And it's a series of ganglia that are located just outside of that spinal vertebral column. Our preganglionic axons then have the ability to have many branches in the sympathetic system. So again, please take a look at this slide. Again, star it, utilize it as some heavy studying, because again, a lot of the information on this slide helps you to understand some of the additional stuff that we're going to discuss. Also, this slide is another good slide because it really takes a lot of what we just touched on and it kind of simplifies it into a little bit of a table for us. But again, sympathetic division, origin of the fibers, the length of the fibers, and the location of the ganglia, and the same thing with the parasympathetic division. Another comparison of the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions kind of gives us an idea of where a lot of these fibers are coming from, what the divisions are, shows us the length of those preganglionic and postganglionic axons. So again, this is also another slide to really help you review, and just notice that this graphic should be in your books that you can utilize as review. Here's our parasympathetic division outflow. This is the cranial sacral. Again, it shows our cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. It shows us what organs are affected or influenced by those cranial nerves. And the same thing by our sacral outflow, that S2 to S4, and where we're going to find those effector organs, and then also finding or taking a look at the ganglia and where those are located. Now, I'm not specifically concerned with you knowing the names of the ganglia. We're not going to necessarily touch on that, but you do want to have a little bit of an idea of what glands or the effector organs are influenced by each of these sections. And again, another overview of the parasympathetic pathway as it pertains to the neurons, the organs, the ganglia. Again, you can kind of review that as you choose to. Now we get into the sympathetic division, which we already know is going to be found in the thoracolumbar region. The preganglionic neurons are going to be found in the spinal cord segments right around that T1 to L2 region. Now those sympathetic neurons are going to be produced within the lateral horn cells of the spinal cord at this segment level, or at these segment levels. We find the pathway, however, is where the preganglionic fibers will actually pass through what we call the white rami communicantes, and they're going to enter the sympathetic trunk, or what we know as those paravertebral ganglia that we identified running alongside the spinal column. So we can see that here. It may not be anatomically correct, but it does give us a good representation of it. Again, we find those levels from T1 down to L2. You see the preganglionic fibers are going to exit and enter that sympathetic chain. And that's where those ganglia are going to be located, again, just right outside of our vertebral column. From here, we're going to end up having one option being a synapse in those ganglia, where they're going to then lead out into the effector organs. And within this ganglia, they're going to synapse them with the ganglionic neuron. So when we look at the organization and anatomy of the sympathetic division, we're going to be looking at the preganglionic neurons and preganglionic axons, as well as the ganglionic neurons and postganglionic axons. We're going to find that the cell bodies are going to be housed in the lateral horn there of the T1 to L2 region. And these are going to be the preganglionic neurons again. These preganglionic neurons are going to be myelinated axons, and they're going to course through the anterior roots of that T1 to L2 spinal nerve region and then branch off. Again, if we think about the anterior or the ventral roots, those are motor branches. And when these preganglionic neurons exit that lateral horn, they are a motor branch. Now they're an autonomic or a visceral motor branch, but they are still a motor branch. So they're going to leave the spinal cord through that ventral or anterior root. Now, as far as the sympathetic trunks and the ganglia, we're going to see that the left and right trunks are just lateral to the vertebral column. The sympathetic trunk resembles a pearl necklace as it runs up and down the vertebral column. The string that connects the pearls are going to be composed of axons. And then the pearls are going to be composed of the sympathetic trunk ganglia that actually contain the cell bodies of our ganglionic neurons. Now we also have to look at the white and the gray rami. And these structures are going to connect the spinal nerves to the sympathetic trunk. Now the white rami communicantes are going to carry the myelinated preganglionic sympathetic axons from the T1 to L2 nerve roots to the trunk. You can think of these as being the entrance ramps to that sympathetic trunk. The gray rami communicantes are going to be unmyelinated. And the unmyelinated axons are going to come from the ganglionic neurons. So we have the unmyelinated postganglionic sympathetic axons, and they're going to go from the trunk to all of the spinal nerves. So these kind of act as the exit ramps from the trunk. So when we look at the sympathetic trunk and those pathways, we have to look at how the neurons enter the trunk and exit the trunk. And so upon entering a sympathetic trunk ganglion, a preganglionic fiber can do one of the following. It can synapse with the ganglionic neuron that is located within the same ganglia that it enters. It can ascend or descend the sympathetic trunk, and it can actually then synapse with another sympathetic trunk ganglion. Or thirdly, it can pass through the trunk ganglion and emerge without synapsing. In these cases, it's often going to synapse with a ganglia that is located very close to the effector organs. Now, normally, the sympathetic pathway has the ganglia very close to the spinal cord. However, there are a few exceptions, in which case the ganglia is located close to the effector. And this more represents the pathway of the parasympathetic pathway. So in one of those options, we have what we call a splanchnic nerve. And so a splanchnic nerve is a preganglionic sympathetic axon that does not synapse in the sympathetic trunk. So it basically represents that third option on the previous slide, where the preganglionic axon, instead of synapsing within the sympathetic trunk ganglia that are right next to the spinal cord, it's going to exit the chain without synapsing and will then synapse in a ganglia that happens to be very close to the target organ. So these are the three options. Again, we have our lateral horn with our sympathetic nerves. It's going to exit that lateral horn in the areas of T1 to L2. It's going to exit through the ventral or the anterior root, and then it's going to come in and enter through our white ramus. And you'll notice here where the brown neuron is, the preganglionic axon, the white ramus is the farther or the more distal rami. In this case, it's going to come in. We'll say it can synapse in the same ganglia with the ganglionic neuron. And then the ganglionic neuron is going to exit through the gray ramus with the postganglionic axon and go to our target organ. Our other option, or number two, was that it would leave the lateral horn through the ventral root, go through the white ramus, ascend or descend without synapsing in the ganglia, and synapse in a different ganglia. Again, it will synapse with the ganglionic neuron, which the cell body is going to be in the ganglia, and then that ganglionic axon will exit through the gray ramus and go out to the target. This graphic shows us where the sympathetic trunk is, and you'll notice that you can see that sympathetic trunk and the sympathetic ganglia, again, very close to the spinal cord. So as we look at that splanchnic nerve pathway, again, we're going to see these with a lot of the effectors that fall in the abdominal and the pelvic viscera. Again, we've said the preganglionic axons will actually pass through the sympathetic trunk without synapsing. These axons then, as they exit the sympathetic trunk without synapsing, will travel in what we call a splanchnic nerve, and it goes to what we call a prevertebral ganglia, where they make their synapses. And then those postganglionic axons will then go to the effectors and innervate them in that fashion. Here we have our splanchnic nerve pathway, which is the third option that we talked about. Here we have our preganglionic neuron and the cell body starting in that lateral horn. It exits through the ventral root and goes into or enters the white ramus. And you'll notice that it exits, again, it can go through, ascend or descend, but it'll go through the ganglia without synapsing until it gets to a ganglia that's a little bit closer to the effector organ. It's this structure then that exits the ganglia that does not have a synapse, still made up of these preganglionic axons, that actually forms the splanchnic nerve. And so you'll notice right down here, that splanchnic nerve is identified. So that leads us then into referred pain. And we've touched on referred pain a little bit in earlier lectures, but when we look at referred pain, we have to look at what visceral pain is. Now, visceral pain is the pain that's perceived or identified in one of your organs. Now, these visceral pain afferents, which are the sensory nerves that carry the pain sensation from the organs, will actually travel along the same pathway as our somatic pain fibers. And so what we'll often see is that the pain stimuli that arises in the viscera can then actually be perceived as being somatic in origin. So what I mean by that is we can oftentimes have pain in certain organs, but it will actually feel like the pain is coming from somewhere else. Now here's a referred pain graphic, and this just shows some of the areas that you're going to detect the pain or perceive the pain that comes from visceral tissue. Some of the most common tend to be the heart and the gallbladder. You'll notice that when you have heart issues, it can actually manifest itself as obviously chest pain, but also can give you pain down the arms. When you look at the gallbladder, you'll notice that there's a couple spots in the back. Oftentimes you'll feel it, one right above the gallbladder itself, then also in the middle back, and oftentimes right around the shoulder blade as well. So those are just some of the key ideas or key visceral organs that can give you different types of referred pain. And again, the pain is originating in the organ, but because it travels along the same pathway as the visceral afferents, you're going to perceive it as somatic in nature. And lastly, we touch on some of our neurotransmitters again. Now, when we look at neurotransmitters, specifically in the autonomic nervous system, we're looking at cholinergic fibers, and they're going to release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Adrenergic fibers are going to release the neurotransmitter norepinephrine. And so when we look at the cholinergic fibers, these are all of our autonomic nervous system preganglionic axons. Again, these all release acetylcholine. It also includes all of our parasympathetic postganglionic axons. Now, our adrenergic fibers, which again release norepinephrine, most of these are going to be the sympathetic postganglionic axons, with a few exceptions that are going to include the sympathetic postganglionic fibers that secrete acetylcholine at sweat glands, as well as some of our blood vessels within the skeletal muscle. Now, this is the end of chapter 15 and the end of all of our lecture material for this term. Today's attendance code word is going to be chapter 15. So again, today's code word for attendance is chapter 15. And again, as always, if you have any questions over this or any of the other material that we covered, either this class or this term as it relates to exam 4 or as it relates to the final exam, you're certainly more than welcome to contact me. We can always set up a Zoom meeting. We can go over anything that you prefer. I hope you've enjoyed this class. I hope you learned something from this class. And again, as always, good luck on exam 4 and good luck on the final as well.